Hello and welcome guys back to the special video. Today I want to talk about what's on everybody's minds, which is COVID-19. And I don't even want to talk in this video about its health effects or how it affects people. I want to talk about the environmental impacts and how it relates to the environment from an environmental science perspective, because that's my major. And for this reason, I believe that the environment is interconnected with almost everything. And for that reason, I want to talk about today in this video specifically about the correlation between animals and COVID-19 and how it all came about, and also how COVID-19 affects the environment and all sorts of issues in this video. So hopefully you guys learned something new, and let's hop right in. So first guys, in relation to animals, I want to mention that COVID-19, starting off, is a zoonotic virus. A zoonotic virus, we know in science, means any virus that comes from an animal and jumps to a human. And usually these viruses can be very deadly, but it doesn't happen that often, but when it does, it's very deadly. As the CDC describes a zoonotic virus, these are germs that spread between animals and people. And even the CDC says this, quote, "Scientists estimate that more than 6 out of every 10 known infectious diseases in people can be spread from animals, and 3 out of every 4 new emerging infectious diseases in people come from animals." So with that being said, a lot of the viruses that we hear about in the media or that we know are common today come specifically from animals. There's swine flu, which comes from pigs, bird flu that comes from mostly birds, and then HIV and AIDS, which we know came from chimps. And then Ebola, there's a lot of evidence pointing that it came from bats and it passed to humans somehow. And now this relates to today in COVID-19, because there's a lot of evidence pointing that a bat transferred it to a pangolin, which eventually made it to a human. Now with all this being said, I want to mention, how does this all relate to where the most likely source of COVID-19 started, which we know and which the media is reporting, which came from Wuhan, China, and its infamous wet markets. So I want to talk about what is a wet market. So to give it a definition, a wet market is where a lot of people buy food, and in other words, live food for the most case, things that are usually killed on the spot. And pretty much I want to make a note that there's wet markets all over the world, but the ones in China are very considered unique because they have so many wild animals, and all animals can carry their own set of diseases. And in China is infamous for having a lot of wet markets, which are considered by most standards very unsanitary. So with the Vox documentary that I'm going to link down below, there's a professor talking in it who is an expert on China and its wet markets, and his name's Peter Lee at University of Houston, and he talks about how you see the wet markets, primarily the one in Wuhan as well, where there's blood, there's spillings, there's poop, everything that comes from animal excrements are all together clustered in that market in Wuhan. And like I said before, zoonotic viruses usually don't pass from animals to humans. You need a host, and that's exactly where the wet market comes in, because you have a bloodbath of all these viruses and bacteria that are accumulating in these wet markets because they have very little sanitation methods. And you have, as Peter Lee said in the documentary, you have animals that are stacked on top of one another. A chicken on top of a dead bear. You have a dead bear on top of a pangolin, bats under that, and like I said, all these excrements are going on top of one another, and that makes it a breeding ground for a lot of viruses to transfer between animals and eventually to a human. And this is also interesting to note because it relates to the fundamental issue that whenever you have any kind of animal killing or animal for consumption, there's always going to be risk associated with animal consumption, whether that's animals that are domesticated or animals that are killed on the spot. And take for example our agriculture industry here, or our chicken industry, our factory farms and things like that. We know that a lot of diseases come from our factory farms when we have unsafe or unsanitary methods of killing chickens. And also this is the same reason we give a lot of antibiotics to chickens here to prevent them from dying, and also to help them grow bigger and faster. And we know that, like I said, from our history, you can look up anything, a lot of these farms like Tyson's factory farms or any other major, company in terms of like meat production, there's always going to be risk associated with the consumption of meat and animal products. And as you guys know, even then, a lot of diseases still happen within our factory farms here in the United States. And so now imagine the situation in Wuhan where you have pretty much no sanitation methods from what most people argue, and you have so many variety of animals, not just chickens or cows. You have all these animals mixing together, like I said, making a bloodbath of all these potential viruses that could come. And as you guys know, there was a menu that was going around the internet that supposedly shows the menu and the variety of all the wild animals that were offered to be sold at this wet market in Wuhan. So with all of this being said, you guys are probably wondering, how does then the Chinese government allow these wet markets to operate and to have formed in the first place despite all the health risks associated? Well, so to give a little history recap as made by this article in the National Review, it was talking about the history of China and how the wet markets came about. It was saying how Mao Zedong and his communist regime, for the most part, failed to feed the huge population of China at the time, and it was on the verge of collapse. So then his successor around the 1970s of Mao Zedong, after Mao Zedong died, made it that people could have their own private farming, and they took away, all the agriculture being done by the state or the government, and was led, in fact, now by people for the first time ever. And this led to a lot of animals being caught and killed for consumption by the average Chinese person. And at first it was something that was small, like I said, amongst, rural farmers and people, just average people. But eventually it became to the point where it got so big that it became these massive wet markets that are pretty much now operate kind of like factory farms, where it's just so many animals and different kinds of animals together. And the government, many people report that they back these wet markets for the fact that it is sustaining people, and people are being able to be fed off these wet markets and these wild animals. And many proponents of the wet market argue that the catalyst that started these massive operations was in 1988, when China's government passed the Wildlife Protection Act. And this pretty much, they argue, gave a green light for people who are hunting wild animals to say that this isn't illegal and that it was right for them to breed and do things like that. And people consider now these wild animals as natural resources, so it gave people the right and the green light to exploitate and use these wild animals for economic benefit or for whatever use they had. Many critics, though, of these wet markets say that this Wildlife Protection Act is ironic because it was meant to protect the animals, but in fact it did the exact opposite, a lot of them argue, which made it that there was all these black markets and killing of endangered or threatened species around China, and it made illegal trading of all these animals more easily accessible. And as this article from the New York Times puts it, the country's first wildlife protection law that dates to 1980s has an official list of 330 endangered species, including pangolins, which I was talking about earlier. And what's interesting is this New York Times article continues to go on, saying how in 2007, only 2007, was it that the sale of pangolin products was outlawed in China, and only in 2008, the Haibu province, where Wuhan is, created 300 wildlife conservation zones. So a lot of proponents argue that the Chinese government took too long to make changes to the selling of these pangolins, which most likely led to COVID-19. So finally, guys, this leads to so many questions. So let's look towards the future now. Now I want to turn the conversation back to you and ask you guys what you guys think of all of this. So the first question I want to ask is, do you guys think there's going to be an international repercussion for everything that's been happening? Do you think the other countries of the world are going to demand the Chinese government to be more efficient and become more stronger in the way they regulate wet markets, or to get rid of them altogether? Secondly, I want to ask you guys, with all the controversy going on right now, that President Trump and a lot of other politicians are talking right now and calling it the quote Chinese virus. I want to ask you guys, do you think it's right to say that this is a Chinese virus or that it was caused by China? And also, there's just so much implications for what's happening. And even today, it's such an interesting issue because it's talking about recently, a lot of news are documenting how a lot of stigma is going against Asian American immigrants in the United States because of everything that's happening. And thirdly, I want to ask you guys, what ramifications does this have? Should China be blamed for this, or is it just a culture thing amongst the Chinese people? Because some people believe that it's a culture amongst a lot of Chinese people to eat these animals because they believe it has a lot of healing and health properties and things like that. But also there's people on the other side that say that it's such a small minority of the Chinese people that eat these wild animals. And when you think about it, it's interesting because when I was reading this, a lot of people were saying how not only is it a small minority that eats these animals, but think about it, only the rich, some proponents argue, are able to afford all these animals they sell at wet markets like lion or bear or like rhinoceros horns or things like that. And also it's interesting because a lot of people are also saying that a lot of it has to do in the areas in China. Some areas are super against wet markets and some live off it. So then is it right to blame a whole population based on what one city or one province or town might be doing? And well, another thing that's interesting that I read up on these articles is it was talking about how now we're seeing a lot of the younger generations primarily fighting against or environmental groups fighting primarily against these wet markets because of the environmental and ethnic concern of animal treatment and things like that. And to add to this conversation, it's interesting, this article by NPR where they bring on this guy Zhen Zongxi, who's a professor at the University of Waterloo, and he has an interesting take on it. He says in the interview how he first off makes the point that a lot of these wild animals are diminishing in terms of what's happening in the wet markets, and the wet markets aren't inherently bad because it helps sustain the people. And I want to ask you guys then, is it right to say that someone can't do something if it's, like they can get rid of the wet markets, but is it economically efficient to get rid of that? And also, I think what he's mentioning in the article is he's talking about how he thinks a better approach, instead of getting the wet markets rid of completely, which might hurt the economy and a lot of people who survive by selling things in the wet markets, he thinks rather a better way is to reform these wet markets and add more regulations to it. Therefore, it's safe, but at the same time, it still sustains people by selling animals that aren't as endangered or threatened. So there it is, guys. COVID-19 from an environmental science perspective. So let me know in the comments what you guys thought, what you guys think of the whole conversation, anything I missed, and if my sources will be linked down below. And if you guys want me to mention anything else, don't be afraid to DM me asking questions and things like that. And I hope you guys learned something new and stay safe during this outbreak.